Dark Tide.
Chapter 1. The Omen. The sea was different that day. Daniel Harker could feel it. He had been a fisherman his entire life, born into the waves and wind of the Atlantic coast. His father and his father before him had taught him to read the ocean like a storybook. Today, the story was one he didn't recognize. The sun hadn't yet risen, and the sky was painted in shades of purple and gray, a canvas of brooding clouds that seemed to hover too low over the choppy waters. As Daniel pulled his small fishing boat, the mariner's luck, away from the dock, the wind whispered in his ears with an eerie chill, sending a shiver down his spine. It wasn't the first time he'd felt uneasy on the water, but this was different. This was something deeper. He cast his nets overboard, the same as he did every morning, letting them sink into the dark, swirling depths below. His hands worked on autopilot, every knot tied with precision, every movement a result of years of muscle memory. But his mind was elsewhere, listening, waiting. The boat bobbed in the rising swell, and Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the sea was holding its breath. He wasn't alone out there. The other fishermen, those who still dared to set out in the pre-dawn gloom, were scattered across the bay. He could see their lights blinking faintly in the distance like stars reflected on the water's surface. They, too, seemed quieter than usual, their radios barely crackling to life with the usual chatter. As the minutes stretched into hours, the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. Daniel kept his eyes on the water, searching for any sign of his net surfacing. But all he saw was a darkness that seemed thicker than it should have been, like ink spreading beneath the waves. Then, without warning, the boat lurched, almost as if something had slammed into its side from below. Daniel stumbled, grabbing onto the rail to steady himself. He peered over the edge, but there was nothing. Just the same dark water, swirling and frothing as if disturbed by something unseen. He felt a tightness in his chest, a knot of fear winding tighter with each heartbeat. "Come on," he muttered to himself, shaking his head as if to clear it. Just the sea playing tricks on you. But when he hauled up the first net, his breath caught in his throat. The net was torn, shredded in places, the thick rope frayed and broken as if something had gnawed through it. Inside, tangled among the ruined threads, was a single fish, a bloated, pallid thing with milky eyes and scales that seemed to glisten with an unnatural sheen. Daniel stared at the fish, a cold sweat breaking out across his brow. He had seen his share of odd catches, but this was different. This was wrong. He reached out, hesitating for a moment before touching the fish. Its skin was slimy, almost sticky, and as he lifted it, he noticed something else tangled in the netting. A scrap of cloth, tattered and dark. He pulled it free and held it up to the light. It was soaked with seawater, but he could make out a pattern. A small, intricate design that looked almost like... His heart skipped a beat. It was part of a dress, a child's dress. A voice crackled over the radio, startling him. "Danny, you there? You get anything?" It was Pete, an old friend who often fished the same waters. Daniel fumbled with the radio, his fingers numb. "Pete, you got anything weird over there?" "Weird? Nah, just the usual. Wait, hold on." There was a pause, then a low curse. "Hell, my nets are all torn up. Looks like they've been through a grinder." Daniel's grip tightened on the radio. "Same here, and I found a piece of clothing. A kid's dress, I think." Silence on the other end. Then Pete's voice, quieter now, edged with concern. "We should head back, Danny. I don't like this." Daniel nodded, even though Pete couldn't see him. "Yeah, let's get out of here." As he turned the boat back toward the shore, the wind picked up, howling across the open water like a banshee's wail. The waves rose higher, slamming against the hull with increasing force, and Daniel's unease grew into something darker, something colder. He glanced back at the sea, the endless expanse of dark water that had been his home for so long. For the first time in his life, it felt like a stranger. And deep beneath the waves, something watched. Will the sea reveal its dark secrets? Or is this just the beginning? Stay tuned for the next chapter. Subscribe and share to follow this chilling tale. Chapter 2. The Vanishing. The wind howled through the narrow streets of Port Milton, a small coastal town that thrived on its fishing industry. Despite the early hour, a crowd had already gathered near the docks, a mix of fishermen, townsfolk, and a few curious onlookers. Word had spread quickly about the strange happenings out at sea, and a sense of unease had settled over the town like a thick fog. Daniel Harker docked the mariner's luck with a heavy heart. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. As he stepped onto the pier, he could feel the eyes of the townspeople on him, their faces lined with worry and fear. His mind raced with questions he couldn't answer, and his stomach twisted with the knowledge of what he had found out there. Sheriff Tom Mallory was already waiting for him, his face set in a grim line. The sheriff was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a reputation for keeping the peace in Port Milton. He had grown up in the town just like Daniel, and they had known each other since they were boys. But now, there was no trace of the easygoing friend Daniel had once known. "Morning, Danny," Mallory said, his voice low and serious. "Heard you had a rough time out there." Daniel nodded, still gripping the piece of the dress he had found in the net. "Yeah, Tom, something's not right. My nets, they're torn to shreds like something chewed right through them. And this," he held out the scrap of cloth. "Found this tangled up in the mess. Looks like a kid's dress." Mallory took the cloth, examining it closely. His eyes narrowed, and he let out a slow breath. "Damn, could be from one of the missing kids." Daniel's heart sank. Over the past few months, 3 children had gone missing from Port Milton, vanishing without a trace. The town had searched every inch of the surrounding woods and beaches, but there had been no sign of them. The disappearances had left a scar on the community, and now, with this new discovery, that scar threatened to tear open again. "You think they're out there?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "In the water?" Mallory's expression darkened. "I don't know, Danny, but we need to find out. Whatever's going on, it's not natural. The sea, it's like it's hiding something." Before Daniel could respond, a shout went up from the other end of the dock. A group of fishermen was gathered around another boat, gesturing wildly. Daniel and Mallory exchanged a glance and hurried over, pushing through the crowd. "What's going on?" Mallory demanded. One of the fishermen, a wiry man named Joe, turned to face them, his face pale. "It's Pete," he said, his voice trembling. "He's gone. Just vanished off his boat." Daniel's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, gone?" "He was right behind me when we headed in." Joe shook his head. "I don't know, man. His boat's here, but he's not. And look." He pointed to the deck of Pete's boat, where a thick layer of salt crystals had formed, as if the sea had receded from it in a sudden wave. Mallory stepped aboard, his boots crunching on the salt. He examined the empty boat, his eyes scanning for any clue. "No sign of a struggle," he muttered. "No blood, nothing. It's like he just disappeared." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He had known Pete for years. They had shared beers at the local tavern, swapped stories, and fished the same waters. The thought of him just vanishing without a trace, like the missing children, was almost too much to bear. "We need to organize a search party," Mallory said, his voice firm. "Check the shoreline, the rocks, anywhere he might have washed up. And we need to figure out what the hell is going on out there." The crowd murmured in agreement, and a few of the younger men volunteered to start searching immediately. Daniel watched them go, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened to Pete was connected to the strange occurrences at sea. The fish, the torn nets, the dress. All of it was part of something bigger, something darker. As the morning wore on, Daniel found himself drawn back to the water. He walked to the edge of the dock and stared out at the ocean, its surface calm and deceptively peaceful. He could feel its pull, a magnetic force that seemed to call to him, urging him to return. "What are you hiding?" he whispered, his eyes fixed on the horizon. What's out there? The wind picked up, carrying with it the faintest sound. A whisper, almost inaudible but unmistakable. It was a child's voice, calling out from somewhere deep beneath the waves. "Help us!" Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He stumbled back, his heart racing, and turned to see if anyone else had heard it. But the townspeople were busy, focused on the search, oblivious to the whisper that seemed to echo in his mind. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't ignore it, couldn't pretend that everything was normal. He had to go back out there, to face whatever it was that lurked beneath the dark waters. And this time, he wasn't coming back until he had answers. What lies beneath the surface? Is Daniel prepared for what he might find? Don't miss the next chapter. Subscribe and share to continue this haunting journey. Chapter 3. Into the Abyss. That night, Daniel could barely sleep. The whisper from the ocean haunted him, replaying in his mind like a broken record. He lay in his small, weather-beaten cottage on the edge of town, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts churning like the dark waters that surrounded Port Milton. The sea had always been his friend, his livelihood, but now it felt like an enemy, a vast, unknowable force hiding secrets he wasn't sure he wanted to uncover. Around midnight, Daniel gave up on sleep. He dressed quickly in the darkness, pulling on his heavy coat and boots. The storm outside had picked up, the wind rattling the windows and the rain beating against the roof in a steady, relentless rhythm. He could hear the distant crash of waves against the rocky shoreline, a sound that usually comforted him, but tonight it set his nerves on edge. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out into the storm. The rain hit him like 1,000 tiny needles, soaking him to the bone within seconds. He made his way down to the dock, his footsteps splashing in the puddles that had already formed on the cobblestones. The town was silent, the streets deserted, everyone huddled inside their homes, hiding from the fury of the storm. The mariner's luck bobbed in the rough waters, tugging against its moorings as if eager to return to the sea. Daniel climbed aboard, his heart pounding. He knew this was crazy, going back out there in the middle of a storm, alone with no idea what he was facing. But he had to know. He had to find out what was happening to his town, to his friends. He had to find Pete. He fired up the engine and steered the boat away from the dock, into the churning waters of the bay. The waves were higher now, crashing against the hull with a force that made the boat shudder. The wind whipped through his hair, and the rain pelted his face. But Daniel kept his eyes fixed on the dark horizon, his grip steady on the wheel. As he pushed further out to sea, the storm seemed to intensify, the wind howling like a living thing, and the waves growing more violent with every passing moment. The boat rocked dangerously, but Daniel held his course, steering toward the deeper waters where he had found the torn nets and the piece of the dress. He felt a pull, an almost magnetic force drawing him forward, deeper into the heart of the storm. Suddenly, the boat lurched, as if caught on something beneath the waves. Daniel fought to keep his balance, his heart hammering in his chest. He peered over the side, but all he could see was the dark, roiling water, lit only by the occasional flash of lightning. The boat lurched again, more violently this time, and he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. A deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from the depths of the ocean itself. He gripped the wheel tighter, refusing to give in to the fear that clawed at his insides. He had come this far, there was no turning back now. He needed to know what was down there, what was hiding beneath the surface. He grabbed a flashlight and shone it over the side of the boat, into the dark water. For a moment, there was nothing, just the endless, black expanse of the ocean. But then, something moved, just below the surface. It was quick, barely more than a shadow, but it was there. Something big, something alive. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He watched, frozen, as the shadow moved again, closer this time. He could see it more clearly now, an enormous, sinuous shape, moving with a strange, almost hypnotic grace. And then, in a flash of lightning, he saw it. A massive, unblinking eye, staring up at him from the depths, filled with a cold, malevolent intelligence. He stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, which rolled across the deck and into the water with a splash. The boat rocked violently, and Daniel clung to the railing, his heart pounding. He had seen that eye before, in his nightmares, in his darkest fears. It was the eye of the ocean itself, a vast, unfathomable creature that had lain hidden beneath the waves for centuries, waiting for the right moment to rise. And now it seemed that moment had come. The water around the boat began to churn, bubbling and frothing as if something was rising from the depths. Daniel watched in horror as a massive tentacle broke the surface, glistening with seawater and covered in thick, black slime. It reached toward the boat, curling and uncurling like a snake, and Daniel realized with a sickening dread that it was searching for him. He scrambled back to the wheel, throwing the boat into reverse. The engine roared to life, and the boat lurched backward, away from the monstrous appendage. But the tentacle followed, moving with a speed and agility that belied its size. Daniel's hands shook as he fought to control the boat, his mind racing. He needed to get away. He needed to get back to shore to warn the others to... But then he heard it again, the whisper, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind and the waves. "Help us!" Daniel's eyes widened. It was the same voice he had heard before, the same child's voice, calling out from somewhere beneath the waves. He hesitated, his hands tightening on the wheel. He knew he should run, should get as far away from here as possible. But the voice, "Help us!" With a deep breath, Daniel made his decision. He turned the boat around, steering back toward the shadow in the water. The tentacle retracted, sliding back beneath the surface, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, the sea began to calm, the waves subsiding, the wind dying down to a whisper. Daniel stared into the water, searching for any sign of movement. And then, slowly, a figure began to emerge from the depths. A small, shadowy shape, rising toward the surface. He leaned over the side, his heart pounding, as the figure came closer, closer, until a small hand broke the surface, pale and trembling, reaching for him. Daniel reached down, his fingers closing around the tiny hand. He pulled, and a child's face broke the water, eyes wide with fear and desperation. She gasped for air, her small body shaking, and Daniel hauled her onto the boat, wrapping her in his coat to keep her warm. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice shaky. The girl nodded, her eyes wide with fear. There's more," she whispered. "Down there, trapped." Daniel's heart sank. He knew what he had to do. He had to go back. He had to save them. But he had no idea what else was waiting for him beneath the dark, cold waters of the ocean. What lies beneath the sea? Can Daniel save the missing children? Or is something darker at play? Stay tuned for the next chapter. Subscribe and share to uncover the mystery. Chapter 4. The Descent. The girl was barely conscious, shivering violently in Daniel's coat as he huddled beside her. The storm had begun to fade, leaving an eerie calm in its wake. The waves that had once raged with fury now lapped gently against the hull of the Mariner's Luck. Daniel kept his arm around the child, trying to warm her as much as he could. Her lips were blue, her skin cold to the touch. He needed to get her back to shore, to safety, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. Not with the knowledge that there were more children trapped beneath the sea. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Emily," she whispered, her voice thin and fragile, as if speaking was an effort that required all of her remaining strength. "Emily, can you tell me what happened? How did you get out there?" Daniel asked, keeping his voice calm and gentle despite the anxiety clawing at his insides. She looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. "It took us," she murmured. "The sea, it took us all. We were playing near the water, and then there was this dark shadow. It pulled us under, down into the dark." Her voice trembled, and tears welled up in her eyes. "There are more of us down there. We tried to swim, but it wouldn't let us go." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard tales, stories passed down from generation to generation about the spirits of the sea, about creatures that dwelled in the deep. He had never believed them until now. "Emily," he said, his voice steady, "I need to go back down there. I need to find the others. Can you stay here on the boat?" The girl's grip on his arm tightened, her eyes filling with fear. "No, please," she begged. "Don't go back. It's dangerous. It's angry." Daniel nodded, feeling the weight of her fear pressing down on him. But he knew he couldn't ignore the other children's cries for help. "I have to try," he said gently. "I'll be quick, I promise." He moved to the side of the boat, searching for the dive gear he always kept on board. He hadn't used it in years. His days of deep-sea diving were behind him, but he knew he needed it now. He pulled on the wetsuit, strapped on the oxygen tank, and fitted the mask over his face. Every movement was automatic, muscle memory guiding his hands as he prepared for the descent. "Stay right here, Emily," he said, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "I'll be back soon, I promise." He didn't wait for her to respond. He couldn't. If he did, he might lose his nerve. He turned and stepped to the edge of the boat, looking down into the dark, swirling waters below. For a moment, he hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. Then he took a deep breath and jumped. The cold hit him like a physical blow, shocking the air from his lungs. The water closed over his head, and for a moment, he was blind, disoriented in the swirling darkness. He kicked hard, pushing himself deeper, away from the surface and into the abyss below. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw the faint outlines of shapes moving in the water around him. Fish, he realized, schools of them, darting through the dark like silver arrows. But there was something else, too, something darker, lurking just beyond the edge of his vision. He could feel it watching him, waiting. He forced himself to keep going, his breaths coming in slow, controlled bursts through the regulator. The deeper he went, the colder it became, the water pressing in on him from all sides. He could see the seabed now, a dark, sandy expanse stretching out into the blackness. And there, half buried in the sand, was something that made his blood run cold. A piece of wood, splintered and broken, with the faint remnants of paint clinging to its surface. It was a piece of a boat. And not just any boat, the mariner's luck. Daniel's mind raced. He was certain that he had left the wreckage far behind, that his boat had been safely anchored back on the surface. But as he reached out to touch the piece of wood, a wave of cold swept over him, so intense it felt like his blood was freezing in his veins. The shadow moved again, closer this time, and Daniel realized with a jolt of terror that it wasn't just one shadow. There were many, dark shapes gliding through the water, circling him, closing in. He fumbled with his flashlight, trying to turn it on with shaking hands. The beam cut through the murk, revealing a tangle of seaweed and broken debris. And then he saw them, faces pale and ghostly, staring out at him from the shadows. Children's faces. They floated in the water, their eyes wide and unseeing, their hair drifting around them like seaweed. Their mouths were open in silent screams, their hands reaching out toward him. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, a cry of horror trapped behind his mask. He had to get out of here. He had to get back to the surface. He turned, kicking hard, his arms slicing through the water as he swam for his life. The shadows moved with him, closing in, reaching out with ghostly hands. But then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the shadows stopped. Daniel felt the water shift around him, a current pulling at him, dragging him down. He fought against it, kicking harder, his lungs burning with the effort. And then he heard it again, the whisper, louder now, echoing all around him. "Help us, please." He stopped, his heart pounding in his ears. He looked down and saw a child's hand reaching up from the darkness, small and pale. Without thinking, he reached out and took the hand, his fingers closing around the cold, clammy flesh. The current surged, pulling him downward, and for a moment he thought he was lost. But then the hand gripped his tighter, and he felt a warmth spread through him, driving back the cold. He looked up and saw a faint light, far above, shimmering through the water. He kicked hard, pulling the child with him, fighting his way toward the surface. The shadows swirled around them, but he ignored them, focusing only on the light, on the promise of air and safety. Finally, with a final, desperate burst of strength, he broke through the surface, gasping for air. He hauled the child onto the boat, collapsing onto the deck beside her, his chest heaving. Emily was there, her eyes wide with fear and relief. "You did it," she whispered. "You found her." Daniel nodded, too exhausted to speak. He looked down at the child he had rescued. A little girl, no more than 6 or 7, her face pale and her lips blue. She was breathing, but only just. He pulled off his mask and oxygen tank, leaning over her. "Hang on," he murmured, his voice trembling. "Just hang on." But as he spoke, the water around the boat began to bubble and churn. The sea was not finished with them yet. What dark force is pulling the children into the depths? Can Daniel save them, or is he in over his head? Keep reading to find out. Subscribe and share to stay hooked on this suspenseful tale. Chapter 5. The Confrontation. The sea began to boil. The once calm waters around the mariner's luck surged violently, sending waves crashing against the boat with a force that made the wood creak and groan. Daniel clutched the 2 children close, his eyes wide with terror as he looked out over the tumultuous waters. The ocean was alive with motion, and Daniel could feel the same dark presence from before. A vast, malevolent force lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to strike. The little girl he had just pulled from the water lay motionless beside him, her breath shallow, her body cold. Emily clung to his arm, her eyes squeezed shut in fear. He needed to get them to safety, but the moment he tried to stand, a massive wave slammed into the side of the boat, knocking him off his feet. He hit the deck hard, his head smacking against the wood with a sharp crack. Stars burst behind his eyes, and for a moment, everything went black. When he came to, the storm had grown worse. The wind howled like a banshee, and the rain fell in sheets, driving against the deck with such force that it felt like needles on his skin. He struggled to his feet, his head throbbing, and tried to gather his thoughts. He had to get back to the wheel to steer them toward the shore, but then he saw it. A shape rose from the water, massive and dark, looming over the boat like a shadow. It was a creature, unlike anything Daniel had ever seen. Its body a tangle of black tentacles that writhed and twisted as it emerged from the depths. At its center, a single, unblinking eye glowed with a cold, otherworldly light. Daniel felt his breath catch in his throat, a scream of terror frozen in his lungs. He had heard stories of sea monsters, of creatures that lived in the deep, but he had never believed them until now. The thing looked down at him, its eye narrowing as if it recognized him, as if it was angry. The creature's gaze swept over the boat, its eye lingering on the 2 children huddled beside Daniel. It let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very air, shaking the boat and rattling Daniel's bones. The children whimpered, pressing closer to him, their eyes wide with fear. "What do you want?" Daniel shouted, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Why are you doing this?" The creature didn't respond, but its eye glowed brighter, and the water around the boat began to churn with a renewed fury. Daniel could feel the pull of the current, dragging them closer to the thing, closer to whatever dark fate it had in store. He had to think. He had to find a way to fight back. He looked around the deck, his mind racing, and spotted the emergency flare gun mounted on the wall. He scrambled to his feet, staggering across the deck as the boat pitched beneath him, and grabbed the gun. He aimed it at the creature, his hands shaking, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Let them go," he shouted. "Let them go or I'll shoot." The creature's eye shifted, focusing on the flare gun, and for a moment, Daniel thought he saw a flicker of fear. But then it let out a roar, a sound so loud and so deep that it seemed to come from the very heart of the ocean itself, and the water exploded around them, waves crashing over the deck and nearly knocking Daniel off his feet. He steadied himself, taking a deep breath. He had one shot, one chance. He pulled the trigger. The flare shot out of the gun with a blinding flash of light, streaking through the rain-soaked air and striking the creature square in its massive eye. There was a deafening roar, a sound of pain and fury, and the creature reared back, its tentacles thrashing wildly. The boat rocked violently, nearly capsizing as the waves rose higher and higher. But Daniel held on, his eyes fixed on the creature. The flare had left a burning, smoking wound in its eye, and it thrashed in pain, its roars echoing across the water. For a moment, Daniel thought it might retreat, might return to the depths and leave them in peace. But then the creature's rage seemed to double, and it turned its full fury on the boat. A massive tentacle rose from the water, curling and twisting as it swung toward them, ready to smash the boat to splinters. Daniel grabbed the children and threw himself to the deck, covering them with his body as the tentacle slammed into the boat with a force that sent them all flying. He hit the deck hard, pain shooting through his shoulder, but he forced himself to stay conscious, to stay alert. He had to protect them. He had to save them. He looked up, his vision blurry with rain and seawater, and saw the creature preparing for another strike. He knew the boat couldn't take much more of this. It would be torn apart, and they would all be dragged down into the depths with it. But then, in the midst of the chaos, he heard it again. The whisper, faint but clear, cutting through the storm like a beacon. "Help us!" The voice was stronger now, more insistent. Daniel looked down at the children, their faces pale and terrified, and felt a surge of determination. He couldn't give up. He couldn't let this thing take them. He pushed himself to his feet, his body screaming in protest, and grabbed a length of rope from the deck. He tied it around the children, securing them to the railing, then turned back to the creature. He didn't know if it would work, didn't know if there was any way to stop the thing, but he had to try. He grabbed the knife from his belt and slashed at the tentacle, cutting deep into the slimy flesh. The creature roared in pain, its eye narrowing with fury, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it lashed out again, knocking Daniel to the deck. He gritted his teeth, pushing himself up once more, and slashed again, harder this time. The tentacle recoiled, blood seeping from the wound, and Daniel knew he had hit a nerve. He struck again and again, each blow more desperate than the last, until the creature finally let out a howl of pain and began to withdraw, sinking back into the depths. The water calmed, the waves subsiding as the creature disappeared beneath the surface. Daniel collapsed to his knees, his body shaking with exhaustion and relief. He had done it. He had driven it away. But as he looked out over the dark water, he knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The sea still held its secrets, and there were still children down there, waiting to be saved. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Is the sea's fury truly abated? Or is it just a moment of calm before the storm? Stay tuned for more. Subscribe and share to follow Daniel's fight for survival. Chapter 6. The Sacrifice. The storm had subsided, but an eerie silence now blanketed the sea. Daniel lay on the deck of the Mariner's Luck, gasping for breath, his body aching from the battle with the monstrous creature. The boat bobbed gently in the water, a stark contrast to the chaos that had raged moments before. He could hear the faint sound of the children crying, their small bodies huddled together for warmth. Emily clung to him, her face pressed against his arm. The other girl, whose name he still didn't know, was curled up beside her, shivering uncontrollably. Daniel knew they were terrified. He could feel their fear like a tangible thing, heavy and suffocating. But there was something else, too. A sense of urgency, a need to act quickly. The creature had been driven back, but Daniel could feel its presence still, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting. It wasn't gone, it was simply biding its time. He had to move fast. "Emily," he said softly, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. "I need you to be brave for me, okay? I need you to stay here with her and keep her safe." Emily looked up at him with wide, fearful eyes. "Where are you going?" "I have to go back down," Daniel replied, his voice steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. "There are more children down there, and I have to try and save them." Emily's grip tightened on his arm, her small fingers digging into his skin. "No, please don't go. It's too dangerous." Daniel gave her a reassuring smile, though he could feel the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him. "I'll be okay. Promise. Just stay here, and if anything happens, you hide. Okay? Stay hidden and don't come out until it's safe." Emily nodded, her eyes filling with tears. Daniel squeezed her hand, then turned and grabbed the diving gear once more. His hands trembled as he checked the oxygen tank and adjusted his mask, but he forced himself to focus. He couldn't afford to be scared, not now, not when lives depended on him. He took one last look at the children, his heart aching with the knowledge that he might not come back. Then he turned and stepped off the side of the boat, plunging back into the cold, dark water. The sea closed over him like a shroud, and for a moment, he felt as though he was being swallowed whole by the darkness. But then his eyes adjusted, and he could see the faint outlines of the seabed below, illuminated by the beam of his flashlight. He kicked hard, propelling himself downward, deeper into the abyss. As he descended, the water grew colder, and the pressure around him increased. He could feel it pressing in on him from all sides, squeezing his chest, making it harder to breathe. But he pushed on, his focus fixed on the faint shapes moving in the darkness below. He reached the seabed and looked around, his flashlight cutting through the murk. He saw more pieces of wreckage scattered across the sand. Broken planks of wood, bits of metal, and other debris that looked like it had been there for years. And then he saw them, the children, floating in the water, their eyes wide and staring, their bodies limp and lifeless. Daniel's heart ached at the sight, but he couldn't let himself give in to despair. He had to stay focused. He had to find a way to bring them back. He moved closer, shining his light on their faces, trying to see if any of them were still alive. But they were still, their faces pale and ghostly in the dim light. And then he saw her, a girl, about Emily's age, her long hair floating around her like a halo. She was different from the others. She was moving, her arms reaching out, her eyes wide with fear. She was alive. Daniel swam toward her, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached out and grabbed her hand, pulling her close, wrapping his arm around her to keep her safe. Her body was cold, but he could feel her heart beating against his chest, fast and frantic. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice muffled by the regulator. "I've got you. You're safe now." But as he began to ascend, the water around them began to churn. He felt a current pulling at him, dragging him back down toward the depths. He looked down and saw the shadow again, the massive, dark shape moving through the water, circling them like a predator. He kicked harder, fighting against the pull, but it was no use. The current was too strong. He was being dragged back down, deeper and deeper into the abyss. The creature's eye glowed in the darkness, watching him, waiting. Daniel knew he couldn't escape. Not like this, not without a sacrifice. He looked at the girl in his arms, her eyes wide with terror, her small body trembling. He couldn't let her die. He couldn't let any of them die. He had to make a choice. He took a deep breath and let go of the girl, pushing her upward with all his strength. She floated up toward the surface, her face turned toward him, her eyes pleading. But he couldn't go with her. He had to stay. He had to face the creature. He turned back toward the depths, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The creature was there, its massive tentacles writhing, its eye glowing with a cold, malevolent light. It was waiting for him. Daniel swam toward it, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing. He didn't know if this would work, didn't know if he could save them, but he had to try. As he drew closer, the creature let out a low growl, a sound that vibrated through the water, shaking him to his core. He could feel its hatred, its anger, radiating from it like a physical force. But he didn't stop. He swam closer, closer, until he was right in front of it, staring into its massive eye. And then he spoke. "I'm not afraid of you," he said, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding. "You want me? You can have me, but you let them go. All of them. You let them go, and I'll stay here with you." For a moment there was silence. The creature's eye narrowed, and Daniel could feel its rage, its fury. But then, slowly, it began to retreat. The tentacles unwound, the current lessened, and the water grew still. Daniel watched as the children began to float upward, their bodies rising toward the surface, toward safety. He felt a wave of relief wash over him, knowing they would be okay. He had done it. He had saved them. But he knew he wouldn't be leaving. He felt the pull of the creature, the darkness closing in around him. He was going to stay here with this thing in this cold, dark place forever. But that was okay. He had made his choice. As the darkness swallowed him, he closed his eyes, thinking of Emily and the other children, of the lives he had saved. And he smiled, knowing he had done the right thing, knowing he had made a difference. The end. If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.